Welcome to today's show called Inside the Bible, produced here at Andrews University. I'm joined today, as always, by my friends Felicia Dattis and Andrew Abbott.
And we're really excited that you're joining us again, but we want to hear from you. So right now, go on our Facebook page, facebook.com/Inside the Bible. Like our page, check out the content that's there, see what others are saying. But we also want to hear from you. So give us your feedback, your thoughts, questions as well. And don't enjoy it all by yourself. Invite your family and your friends to also like our page.
In our last episode, we walked through some tough situations in the Old Testament that can remind us of some of the challenges we face today. And in today's episode, we will dive deeper into this subject. Have you ever been betrayed by those close to you? Has a spouse or a parent or sibling or a child failed to deliver in your relationship? Well, those issues will come under discussion today.
Betrayal is painful. It is in these moments that some of us call out for God for help. Some call to superior forces, make promises to saints, or just hold on to whatever we believe. But what happens when there's no apparent answer?
God's silence is a big thing. When we're suffering, is He even there? Is He doing anything? And that's what our investigation and program is going to tackle today. So I hope that you are ready. I am, because it starts right now.
I don't know about you, but siblings are always a mixed bag for me. Just because they are incredibly fun, but there are also some less pleasing experiences mixed in there as well. And for siblings, there's always that undercurrent of possible sibling rivalry as well. And we see this situation not only in families today, not only in our own experiences, but also in the Bible. It's especially bitter, in fact, when this rivalry turns to betrayal. And this is exactly the situation we're looking at when we see the story of Joseph and his half-brothers. But it's especially heartbreaking when we compare this dysfunctional situation with God's ideal for siblings. There's usually always a discouraging gap between our God-given dreams of what we want to see happen and the cold reality of this world. This is the experience that Joseph could definitely relate to. And the following question probably crossed his mind many times. In the midst of all these disappointments and injustice and trouble, why should he bother staying faithful? This question has haunted the minds of many sufferers through the ages, and we will encounter it again as we take a close look at the life of Joseph.
Let's talk a little bit about his first experiences. Living at home, he's living among his brothers. Let's talk a little bit about that, the tension there was, the visions he had. What are some things that strike you as interesting in that part of his life?
I just wonder if there's a connection here between Jacob's story and Joseph's story. I mean, Jacob was the underdog, right? Yeah. He's the younger brother. He's looking at Joseph, the only son of, well, not the only, but one of the sons of Rachel. I wonder if he was thinking, that's a boy I can relate to. Yeah. I think that's the one who should have the birthright, so to speak. Right, and the other brothers seeing that connection there, boy, they must have been just the steam rising from their ears, seeing that he could be the one who's in charge of us at some point if this goes through.
Yeah, any of us who have siblings, I don't know if you guys have siblings or not. I've got 3 siblings. Rivalry. I've got an older brother, so rivalry is just a part of growing up, right? Especially you can just feel these guys. Who is this upstart? And it's especially touchy because he's one of 2 sons of the favorite wife, Rachel, and the other ones are just kind of they're almost treated like secondary children, and so you can just see that's not a healthy home situation.
Yeah, and it's interesting because they're using these kids as ploys to get favoritism with Jacob too, aren't they? These two wives, like, oh, I have this many sons. Well, I have this son over here. Well, they're trying to, use that as a ploy to get Jacob to take notice of them. So that makes it really bad too.
You can kind of see it go to his head a little bit too. It's funny, like when you read the Bible, you don't really get the inflections and the things that are insinuated. But the way he makes everybody upset, I'm sure he just didn't say, "Oh, look, guys, I had this great dream." I'm sure he was like, "I had this dream."
Well, he showed up with his coat too. Let's not forget that. I mean,
and it's great when actually Jacob calls him out on it. When he has the dream about the stars and the sun and the moon, and Jacob's kind of like, well, I don't really care that you were saying your brothers would bow down to you, but you're saying now your parents are going to bow down to you? I don't think so.
When you think about when Joseph was born, Jacob had, in this case Israel, had actually two wives who were trying to struggle for supremacy to be the number one wife. And you do that by having the most number of children of the same father, but eventually they stopped procreating, so they use their slave, since they were their property, as the father concubines to steal a claim that they had the greatest number of children, but that brought rivalry even among the slave and among the wife of Jacob. So Joseph is born to that, and that jealousy, that rivalry also went from their parents to the children. So Jacob's brothers also, copying after the patterns of their own parents, also were emerged in jealousy, internal strife, envy, and just looking for be daddy's favorite. But daddy had chosen his own favorite, that was Joseph.
In fact, he was such a favorite that Joseph got away with things. Sometimes the things that he said to his brothers, it surprises me, because who would say that to the brother who's like 10 or 15 years older than you are, to tell them that, hey, you're going to bow down to me at some time in the future? Well, he was so favored that his father, Jacob, made for him a very special garment. Now we know that during this time, people had very brightly colored clothes. They didn't all wear just the white, drab, or gray, or brown colored tunics. Indeed, they were known for their brightly colored garments. Now this took very special skill, and to have your father make a garment like this for you, well, that was very special, and it meant that he was very special, and everybody knew it.
So Joseph became the centerpiece, and then he started having these dreams, which, God is telling him, I saw this bunch of stars that they were just going and kneeling towards me. So Joseph started telling these dreams to his brothers, and his brothers said, wait a second, our father thinks you're the favorite. Look at your clothes. Nobody has that. And then you're going to tell us that God is also telling you that you are his favorite. So they decide to take revenge and submit Joseph to the lowest of possible that any human being could be at that time, slave. We will call it today human trafficking.
The only thing I really could do is just dig my heels in and just pray. That's all I could do.
When you're living up on the high life, and then all of a sudden you're, pushed down to cleaning toilets, there's a certain respect that you begin to have for those people.
Have you ever felt that everything was going against you, and how did you overcome this situation?
With a lot of prayer. Luckily, I had my husband with me, so he was able to help me as well.
This summer at camp, Akita, it was just a really tough week. I was feeling sick and everything, and there was a lot of crazy circumstances, and everyone was just feeling attacked, and I was feeling it too. And the only thing I really could do was just dig my heels in and just pray. That's all I could do. And just doing that, like just accepting that it was out of my hands and going to God really just made a huge difference. And I went through it just day by day, praying every single day.
Joseph was born in Padan Aram, while his father Jacob was working for his grandfather Laban. Being the firstborn son to his father Jacob's favorite wife Rachel made him feel especially loved and celebrated. God had been communicating with Joseph's ancestors by dream for a few generations, and now it was Joseph's turn. All the privilege in life seemed to melt away when he was sold by his brothers to slave traders, who in turn sold him into slavery in Egypt. Now normally, life as a masculine slave in Egypt would have involved rock quarrying, mining, or some other hard labor activity, but Joseph was placed in housework. As the story goes, the mistress of the house fancied him, and when he refused, he was accused of assaulting her, an accusation that should have ended in his immediate death. But rather than death, or even being put into the general prison population, Joseph was put into the prison that was maintained by his master, the captain of the bodyguards of Pharaoh. So it was, when two political prisoners were arrested, they entered the prison where Joseph was. They each had a similar but slightly different dream, and when Joseph found out, he told them what the dream meant. It was at this point that Joseph moved from simply having dreams of his own, as his ancestors and even he himself had had, to being able to interpret the dreams God gave to others. It is in this way that we see that God was with him, even in bad situations.
Let's move on to Joseph now in Egypt. His brothers sold him into slavery. They lied to his father. His father was devastated. Jacob, that was his favorite son. So he's now in Egypt, and I want to talk a little bit about his character here. He's making choices, whether he likes to or not. He's making choices. The Bible records some of these choices. Let me know what some of the choices are that stick out to you, and how that portrays him, how that shows what kind of a character he had.
Well, I don't know what their mentality exactly was as Egyptians, but I can imagine that for slaves in a very pagan country, it must have been very demoralizing for anyone, but for slaves in particular, as they were coping with that. And I can imagine the peer pressure that he must have had. I'm sure Potiphar had a whole team of slaves around him. They're like, "Come on, Joseph, we're off now. We did our duty. Let's go and worship and have some fun over at the altar." And Joseph's like, he's faithful, right? He stands up against it because God is with him, and I'm sure that's one of the qualities that right off the bat that distinguishes him as a faithful steward to Potiphar.
And somewhere in here there's a transition for him, and it's not really in the text, but somewhere there's a transition where he goes from being spoiled brat to being somebody who's not just going to give up with his situation, but he's going to grab hold of the things he was taught, the faith he was raised with, and he's smart, and he's going to really apply himself to the situation he's in.
But hey, being a slave will do that to you. When you're living up on the high life, and then all of a sudden you're pushed down to cleaning toilets, there's a certain respect that you begin to have for those people. There's a certain you begin to understand what it is that people go through, and seeing real hardship and actually going through that and experiencing that, it creates a certain sympathy within you for other people and what it is that they go through, and a respect for other people. And I think that is something that Joseph picked up as he went along.
Slavery was not unusual in the ancient Near East. In fact, it was a very common practice. And selling your brother into slavery, however, that is very unusual. But these people, they sold them to these sort of merchants. They're not what we would call a slave trade in Egypt. In Egypt, there was no slave market. There was no place where you can buy and sell slaves. And the reason, because everybody in Egypt was a slave. Whether it was the vizier, or whether it was the serf, or whether it was the peasant, it doesn't matter who you were a slave. You were a slave of the king, because the king was divine, and everything belonged to the king. So when Joseph came into Egypt, he wasn't taken to a slave market, because there were no slave markets. Instead, Joseph was sold to an individual, almost like a contract basis.
So here we have Joseph. He's being captured by the Ishmaelites. He's on his way to Egypt, and then he reaches there to be sold as a slave to Potiphar. what are the tasks in the position that Joseph most likely would have had in that position at the bottom of the heap of all the servants that are already serving here in Potiphar's household?
Immediately, the text presents him as being a slave or a servant of a very high official. And he had to have been, he couldn't have been an ordinary slave. In other words, he wasn't a prisoner. He wasn't like the Hebrews were later. He wasn't building houses like out of mud brick. He wasn't working in the fields. He wasn't working in linen manufacturing. He was working specifically in a household, and eventually working to the point where he's now the steward of the house, the overseer, keeping track of everything that goes on, all the counting of all the animals, the counting of all the servants, if there's linen production or whatever else Potiphar is up to as far as finances are concerned. Joseph is now in charge of it all.
So if he was in the fields, if he was in a position where he's basically getting into the agricultural scene of the land of Egypt and he wasn't in a household setting, would there have been any possibility of him rising up the ranks, so to speak, or getting that position later on that he did as the steward of the house?
In Genesis 41, 39 to 45, it describes Joseph's rise to power, where he suddenly is taken not from a household slave, but actually a slave who was condemned to a prison for an offense that normally we would imagine would have ended in his death. It didn't end in his death, but he ends up in a prison, and from being in the prison and being the overseer of the prison eventually, he is risen up in power to the second ruler only after Pharaoh. It seems odd that an Asiatic slave would end up in this way.
Now, one of the things you might be wondering is how can a guy who is essentially doing hard time for a crime which he didn't commit, how do you go from being this slave to being the great vizier of Egypt? Indeed, probably Joseph is credited for saving Egypt during this famine. Is that possible? Well, what we found in ancient Egypt, because everybody was equal under the law in a sense, because they were all servants of the king, you had the ability to move up in society. It wasn't just based upon your class or your social status. A person who could gain favor from the king by doing any number of things. Soldiers, for example, who distinguished themselves in battle, they could be elevated from a simple footman to become a general in a matter of years, and there are many examples of that in ancient Egypt. You can have people who are just craftsmen who suddenly, within a few years, they become a priest in one of the greatest temples in the ancient world. So, was it possible? Absolutely, but only possible in ancient Egypt. It was possible because in ancient Egypt, everybody was equal, and at least in some sense. They were equal in that they all belonged to the king, and the king could move you from the lowest slave to the highest position anytime he chose. Most of the people who interpret the story look through the lenses of modern Western world.
He could have taken, his power and used it against those that oppress him, and he was right. We will call that today justice.
Do you think that God would choose you to do something great?
I think the story's still being written, so I can't answer that yet, but I would hope so.
I absolutely believe that because God's way is the best way. He, in Jeremiah 29, he has a plan for us, and I fully believe that no matter what, even if it's a struggle for me sometimes, that ultimately he's going to have his best interest for me.
I think all of us are chosen to do something great. It might be like something small, it might be something big, but everything that God has in store for us is something great. And for me, I'm not sure if I'm gonna, be a reformer in the church or something, but if I can make a small difference in like a young person's life and, influence them to love God, that is a huge difference. That's amazing.
So Joseph rose up in Egypt from a slave to the second in command behind only Pharaoh. It seems then that we should expect to see his name somewhere in the archaeological remains. But this depends on when Joseph was in Egypt. There are two theories in this regard. One is that he was in Egypt during the Middle Kingdom, when Egypt was united under only one ruler. The other is that he was in Egypt during the Second Intermediate Period, when Semitic foreigners were in control of the government in the north. There is archaeological evidence of Semitic visitors visiting Egypt in the iconography at Beni Hassan. But we know from the stories in the Bible that both Abraham and Isaac visited Egypt. But Joseph's name, Hebrew or Egyptian, has not been found. Although we might not have Joseph's name in the archaeological record, we can see that in the textual record, because he was willing to be used by God, his faith in God in the hard times eventually provided a way for his family to be saved, a family that would grow into the nation of Israel.
You know, when you come to the end of the story of Joseph, the question that everybody asks is, wants to know, what is the point? What is the purpose of this story? Why was it in the Bible in the first place? I mean, it's a great story and all, but is there anything of any value? For most, when they see this story, they look at Joseph and they say, ah, yes, I understand the values. The values are perseverance, loyalty to God. This is a story about hard work. This is a story about strength. These are Roman values. Most of the people who interpret the story look through the lenses of modern Western world. What are the values that we appreciate? And when we watch somebody who goes from rags to riches, we think, ah, I can do that too, if I follow their path. And what did they use? Hard work, perseverance, strength, all of these values. But these come much later in the ancient world. These are what we call Roman values, or modern Western values. The story of Joseph is about something probably more important, and certainly it is connected to the period. And we have to think about going back in time. Joseph is taken by his brothers, he's thrown into a cistern, he's sold into slavery, he lives in Egypt, he rises to the power of being the vizier. And now the question is, the point of the story. Now his family returns. The brothers are so afraid that he is going to have them killed, because that's exactly what they would have done. But this isn't a story about crime and punishment. This is a story about grace. This is a story about family. Joseph had a family, and his responsibility to that family was to do whatever he could in order to preserve the family.
Joseph decides to forgive his brothers. Joseph decides to pay them not what they deserved, but that which they did not deserve. And instead of submitting them to more humiliation or pretty much submitting them to death, he tells them, I am your brother, and God put me here for a purpose, and I'm going to fulfill that particular purpose. And that is the most powerful aspect in the story of Joseph. Because humanly speaking, he had the right to revenge. Humanly speaking, he could have taken, his power and used it against those that oppress him. And he was right. We will call that today justice. That's why we put people in jail, to make an example of them. We make them pay for what they've done. But in the case of Joseph, Joseph decided to act with mercy, with grace, and with love, and forgive. And that attitude made him a redeemer of his own brothers, and as in consequence, a redeemer of the nation of Israel.
Personally, I learned a lot from this program about Joseph. I learned that God always has a plan, and that waiting for God to act is essential. And finally, if we stay faithful, if we cling to Him in those tough moments, we will receive His reward, even if it takes a lifetime.
Joseph's time as ruler in Egypt is a mystery, historically. There are many theories about when he might have lived in Egypt. Archaeology has helped us understand that his story could have happened as the Bible describes. It is possible that he could have been the savior of the future of Abraham's seed, and that this account is not just an invention in the Bible to teach us moral principles.
Remember, you are a vital part of this journey, and we want to hear from you. So remember to check out our Facebook page, facebook.com/InsideTheBible. Share your comments, your feedback, what you've been learning as we've continued on our journey inside the Bible.
In today's episode, we finished the book of Genesis. By turning one page, we get to one of my favorite characters in the Bible. As an Egyptian archaeologist, I'm a big fan of Egyptian history. The kings, the culture, the architecture, the story in Exodus comes alive to me as I see all of these things in this book. I can't wait to keep digging. What can we find along the banks of the Nile to help us understand the life of, arguably, the most influential person in the entire Old Testament? Join us next time in our search for answers as we go inside the Bible.
One thing you should know about slavery in ancient Egypt is that it was not like slavery in ancient Rome.
The Hebrews would have built mud brick in much the same way as you see this brick here.
Do you believe that God has a purpose for your life?
Some of the hardest parts is trying to figure out what that is.
Is this scenario like totally just out of this world rare?
And they hide him right there, as if he is the gift that she's looking for from the gods.
Some have suggested that this was the Princess Hatshepsut, who would once become the great female queen of Egypt.